Our first session is titled Response and Experience. COVID-19 has profoundly shifted our experience of public and domestic spaces alike, and as have the range of interventions, policies, and social practices that have emerged to enforce social distancing in communities across the globe. Papers in this session will address how urban and rural communities are experiencing and responding to COVID-19 in daily life, at work, at school, and in urban spaces. How governments have envisioned or imposed interventions and the often uneven impact of these interventions on urban communities, the ways in which communities are responding to or resisting such interventions, how the epidemic has shifted social practices and experiences in public and domestic spaces, and the future of a range of institutions and practices in a post-COVID world. What these case studies remind us of collectively is the need for social connection and of tending to the social and physical aspects of experience, and even especially in a socially distanced context. The moderator for this session is my friend and colleague, Dr. Eliana Abu Hamdi. Dr. Abu Hamdi is program manager for the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative at MIT, as well as an adjunct assistant professor at Hunter College. She is an architectural historian, urbanist designer, and global South scholar with published articles and contributed chapters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mohammed and Caitlin, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and be part of this wonderful project. I'll begin by introducing our first speakers for the first paper. Nicole Lalouvier is a doctoral fellow at the Institute of Landscape and Urban Studies within the Department of Architecture, ETH Zurich. Her doctoral research project is an investigation into the landscape and material history of the irrigation systems of the Canton Valais in Switzerland. Her co-presenter is Renal Sargent. She's an urbanist, planner, and design and community advocate based in Trinidad and Tobago. She's a former Chevening Scholar who earned a Master of Research in Interdisciplinary Urban Design from the University College of London in the UK. Her work lies at the intersection of urban studies, public sector reform, and technology, with a focus on public space and design.
This paper proposes to examine the social practice of liming as a form of commoning in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in Trinidad and Tobago. This Caribbean nation is separated from the South American continent by two narrow channels, each only 10 kilometers wide. Like its close neighbor Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago is an oil-rich country, which has been among the most prosperous territories of the West Indies for about 150 years. About half the population resides in the urban east-west corridor, stretching east from the coastal capital, Port of Spain. This is where most of the COVID-19 cases have been located. Trinidad and Tobago has experienced strict enforcement of public health measures since March 2020. These have had a particularly noticeable impact on so-called liming, a fundamental component of social life on the islands. Liming is both an activity and an attitude, a ritualized practice, but one with few stable rules, although it usually involves eating, drinking, dancing, and storytelling. It operates through spontaneous, informal, and novel reconfigurations of collective action in space. Liming is based on playfulness, humor, and freedom. As we shall illustrate, the everyday practice of liming contributes to the production of the urban commons. Indeed, liming is a prime example of commoning, as defined by architect and theorist of the commons, Stavros Stavridis. He defines commoning as a practice of doing in common. Understood as a form of commoning, then, liming is a means to claim and appropriate space outside of any prevailing authority. Everywhere can be a place to lime, and thus liming occurs both in public spaces such as parks and beaches, and private clubs or residences. Trinbagonians practice commoning through liming. We consider liming to be a form of commoning par excellence. That is, a set of ritualized common practices structured through tacit common norms that enable the appropriation of urban space as a common resource.
Empirical observations highlight the epidemic's mixed impact on liming, which include curtailment, adaptation, and persistence of the practice. During the initial lockdown phase, locks were placed on public spaces such as Lord Harris and Woodford Squares to prevent social gathering. To date, many of these locks remain in place. Police removed persons who illegally gathered in public spaces. This translated to empty streets, squares, and promenades, which are usually the focal points of liming in major urban centers. Legislation focused on limiting gatherings on beaches and along rivers, streams, and springs, all desirable liming locations. Frequent police patrols sought to control mask wearing and distancing, dispensing rewards in the form of vouchers or punishment through fines. Restrictions imposed on public liming locations shifted many limes to private residences. This raised legal issues for the implementation of COVID-19 restrictions, which now had to be applied within the private domain. Disparities were observed in police raiding so-called popular zesta parties, while large upscale weddings were allowed to take place. Although illegal, street vending is an integral part of the commons in Trinidad and Tobago. It is also often associated with curbside liming. Vending on the popular Charlotte Street in Port-of-Spain was shut down in March, while other vendors were relocated to a market area to ensure regular sanitization and physical distancing. In mid-May, the easing of regulations allowed street vendors and restaurants to resume curbside pickup and takeaway services. The need to ensure physical distancing and frequent sanitizing led to the retooling of public spaces. Common features included the installation of signage, physical barriers, and outdoor sinks. These can be seen as material expressions of the commons as threshold spaces and sites of encounter that were now being mediated through physical devices. Street food vendors were directed to prohibit their customers from congregating and consuming meals on site. This led to the emergence of creative alternatives that allowed limers to reappropriate the urban commons. Indeed, with little public seating available, car parks emerged as sought-after liming locations. For example, in the Eddie Hart Savannah Park, sitting inside with doors open or in the vehicle trunk, limers enjoyed street food while socializing with their neighbors.
Throughout the pandemic, sidewalks remained favored liming locations. Although all Trinis lime, no matter their age, race, ethnicity, religion, or socioeconomic status, liming retains a classist and gendered character. When liming takes place on street corners and the limers are young Black men, it can be perceived as idling or loitering. However, liming can be productive, since it may provide useful information about the availability of wage labor. As a form of commoning, it is a means to cope with the harsh conditions of urban life. In conclusion, this case study has offered us the opportunity to confront urban commons theory with specific issues raised by the COVID-19 pandemic in a small island nation. It has illustrated the resilience of liming and the urban commons in the face of the COVID-19 shock. We suggest the resilience of liming may be due to certain characteristics that could be promoted in other forms of urban commons, namely flexibility and adaptability, few institutionalized rules, and an ability to take place in a multiplicity of spaces, whether public or private. Moreover, COVID-19 has highlighted how adaptations to the urban commons may be beneficial beyond the pandemic. Some of the sanitary adaptations already put in place, such as outdoor sinks and transparent barriers, may remain in place since many view them as overall improvements. They also point to other low-cost interventions that could improve common spaces, such as walls, rails, seatings, water outlets, and public toilets. These types of urban design interventions support the urban commons as a space of thresholds and a site of encounter with others. Thank you for your attention. This paper proposes.
Our next presenters are of a group of three, but Frederick Cameron will be the speaker. He's a city planner with a double PhD degree within the European Joint Doctorate Urban History, awarded by the Universidad de Valladolid in the Department of Urbanism and Representation of Architecture, as well as the Bauhaus University. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Culture at the University of Venice. The second contributor is Luca Maria Francesco Fabrice, a journalist and architect who obtained an architectural and environmental technology and a master in urban planning and environment. They're a distinguished expert at the Beijing University of Civil Engineering and Architecture and associate professor in environmental design at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Politecnico di Milano. Finally, Riccardo Maria Balzarati is an architect and partner of the Milanese architectural firm AOUMM, founded in 2012, developing many designs and research projects at different scales, such as the first prize an international design competition for a pedestrian bridge in Milan. He is currently a fellow researcher at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Politecnico di Milano, focusing on the revitalization of the Italian community cinemas.
Hello everybody, this presentation deals with Superblock's experience in Barcelona, Spain as a promising pandemic response. This work has been carried out in collaboration with Luca Maria Francesco Fabris and Riccardo Maria Balzarotti, with the objective of delineating the potential role that a superblock may play in mitigating the negative effects of COVID-19. This work presents the change occurred in Poblenou superblock unit having effect in contrasting the pandemic. This analysis comprises a desk research activity together with a fieldwork in September 2020 based on 15 residents and 15 non-residents interviews, a statistical reference sample indicated by the local association Poblenou Veïns i Veïnes. Superblock is though as a social unit, a tight-knit community with shared common facilities, resilient against the stresses of climate change and social vulnerability. This experiment regards the grouping of 9 square shade blocks of Cerdas extension, resulting in a standardized 400 square meters urban cell each, with an average of 5,500 inhabitants, including public open spaces such as streets, sidewalks, and at least a square. The forecast impact of superblocks on Barcelona citizens' quality of life expected to mitigate the negative impact of COVID-19 through the following improvements. The first application of superblocks took place in 2016 in Poblenou to create a neighborhood unit located in the northeastern part of Barcelona. During the quarantine and the slow reopening, all interviewees valued positively the new urban environment features, as they have strengthened the sense of community, security, safety, and well-being, plus the necessity for Barcelona to invest on a public health-friendly urban design. As confirmed by the survey conducted in late September 2020, the implementation of superblocks have thus effectively operated on health and socio-economic inequities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And here we can see some images of this neighborhood unit, empty and with people wearing masks. The reasons that confirm us that superblocks operating on health and socio-economic inequities are the following. The measures adopted in Poblenou, such as the restrictions on speed limits and higher parking costs, reduce the tendency to drive and thereby encourage the use of bicycles and public transport, thus improving mental and physical health associated with lower levels of pollution and traffic. Second, superblocks tackle COVID issues by cutting space for private vehicles, incorporating new walkable spaces with well-connected streets, providing easy access to shops and services, and making public spaces friendly for residents and city users. By doing so, by mitigating the negative effects of density, the superblock increased the sense of community and the social sustainability, even during the lockdown, improving the performance, flexibility, and durability of the spaces individuals and families could occupy, respecting the social distances. Thirdly, despite local residents' worries about price increasing as direct result of the improvements introduced in the neighborhood, market values seems to follow the general real estate trend, unaffected by the superblock operating change. Moreover, the new Catalan law on urgent measures on rent containment in housing contracts of September 2020 will control the prices so as not to increase disproportionately. Also, governance issues in the short, medium, and long terms are the following. First, superblocks require a considerable budget availability to expand them in the entire city due to the high cost of implementation. The first superblock in Poblenou costed 3.5 million euros, while the amount spent for Sant Antoni neighborhood unit rised up to 8 million euros. The lack of open debate with citizens in Poblenou caused protests against the poor involvement of local residents. The launching of the successive superblocks, such as the Sant Antoni ones, have been accompanied by open debates with citizens. Thirdly, the overlapping of Poblenou unit to the existing built environment implied two types of issues. The mobility system showed incoherence when it changed the traffic flows without implementation in the whole system, and bicycle lanes were not fully reallocated, thus generating conflicts between pedestrians and cyclists. Moreover, no underground parking replaced the removed parking lots. So, the lesson learned is that superblocks can be intended as a specific form of tactical urbanism. In fact, superblocks adapt urban design, reclaim public spaces for citizens, rethink location of essential urban functions, reduce traffic, and enhance cycling and walkable facilities. And we understand that the basic principles of superblocks have countered the negative impact of COVID-19 by making the neighborhood units more inclusive, resilient, sustainable, and safer. But despite the fact that superblocks pertain to the pre-pandemic period, this model has relevance beyond the crisis, and superblock may provide thus feasible solution for the post-COVID-19 city to be applied carefully, case by case, in other contexts.
Our next set of presenters, we'll have one speaker and one co-author. Musa Al-Nayadi is an architectural engineer with a Master of Science in Architectural Engineering from the United Arab Emirates University. Currently, she is working as a head section of the Supervision on Maintenance and Construction Projects of UAE Missions Abroad in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. She has been awarded several times, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation Excellence Award under the Distinguished Engineer category, most recently in December of 2018. Khairat Al-Aoun is currently a professor of sustainable architecture and chair of the Architectural Engineering Department at the United Arab Emirates University in Al Ain. Khairat draws from 25 years of international academic and professional experience in the US, North Africa, and Middle East. She is engaged in education and practice-based research focusing on advancing the design and execution of sustainable, socio-culturally sensitive built environment in hot climatic zones. Her performance buildings and human factors in the built environment are her major areas of expertise, research, and publication. Khaira holds a PhD in building science from Sheffield University, and she was a Fulbright scholar at Arizona State University in the US. She's also a LEED accredited professional.
The conventional and well-established workplace and working modalities may be drastically challenged, more than any other building sector, following the disruptive and instant changes imposed by the recent global pandemic. It forced government to impose drastic mobility and distanciation measures, which as a result caused complete disruption to the office employee work experience. At a minimum, the pandemic is likely to change or accelerate the existing trends, such as the working model, but it may also inspire technological advances related to health and satisfaction of building occupants. So truly, the workplace is venturing into a grand social experiment territory that may lead to questioning the need of the office as we know it and its future format that has yet to be framed. The aim of the research is to explore and identify the impacts of the current coronavirus pandemic on the workplace and its users' concerns, experiences, satisfaction, and expectations. The main purpose is to investigate how the pandemic may be shifting the work model and what may be its implication in workplace design. Hence, the objective explored three main aspects. First, it investigated the employees' concerns and fears about returning to the workplace. Second, it assessed the impact of the pandemic on work model preferences and productivity. And third, it questioned the participants' expectation for the future of office design and layout. This study took place in Abu Dhabi, the capital of United Arab Emirates. The UAE may be a small country, but it has witnessed a tremendous economic and urban growth with a high density of office spaces. So the objective were investigated through a survey carried among the employees of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the UAE, based in Abu Dhabi, and was conducted during the first 3 weeks of November 2020, gathering a total of 68 respondents. The results showed, understandably, that the main concerns of the participants were related to health implications of their families and themselves. This kind of challenges is timely and may be reduced or eliminated once the virus declines. The most striking result, despite the no preparation for such rapid shift, was the overwhelming preferences for a full switch to either working from home, as expressed by 26% of respondents, or a mixed working model with 2 days from home and the rest from office, prepared by 57% of participants. And this highlights an overwhelming majority preference for a hybrid working model. Further, the results also showed that while the respondents were working from home, they were more or equally productive compared to their productivity in the physical workplace, while positively enabling them to keep a better work-life balance. On the other hand, the most missed work aspect while working remotely was interacting and meeting with the co-workers, or in other terms, the interactive social dimension of work. The immediate impact on office design is understandably the preference for increased distance between workstation and more private offices. In conclusion, the rapid shift opened the doors to look for the possibilities to accommodate a new work model of where personal versus work life can strike a better balance. So what does the workplace survey tells us about the future of the office work and the workplace? Well, first of all, it tells us that we are moving toward hybrid or flexible working model, since the results showed that people can work efficiently and comfortably from home, but they do miss the opportunities for interaction and socializing, and this fact cannot be ignored. So this means that the lesson learned from the experience of working from home during COVID-19 offer an unexpected opportunity to rethink of the future of work and the design of the workplace. It suggests to think of different forms. For example, first, it will ultimately incite the need of drawing new guidelines of workplace design and office layouts to satisfy occupants' needs and address the requirement of safety and sustainability. For example, co-working or shared office spaces. Secondly, to allocate more square footage per employee than existing building, with some offices potentially gravitating to more individual office space rather than open floor plans, and with a prime focus on meeting places that calls for a diverse layout and furnishing. Secondly, it also calls for innovative technologies for realistic virtual meetings and inspire technological advances related to health and wellness of building occupants. Thirdly, the need of integration of biophilic design, incorporation of natural element and material, also using possibly outdoor, such as patios or courtyard as a workspace. Finally, the future of work and the workplace are challenged in an unprecedented way, calling for designers and researchers to explore, rethink, repurpose, and recreate the workplace.
The next presenter is one speaker and one co-contributor. Ross T. Smith is a senior lecturer in architecture at Deakin University in Australia. He completed a bachelor and master's degree in New Zealand and a PhD at the University of Melbourne, and was awarded a postdoctoral research fellowship in Paris. His theoretical and teaching focuses phenomenology and experiential learning in architectural design studios. Smith is also a practicing artist who exhibits internationally. His co-contributor is Cecilia de Marinis. She's a lecturer in architecture at Deakin University, also in Australia. She completed her PhD studies in sustainable urban design at the University of Roma and was a postdoctoral research fellow at RMIT University in Melbourne. She practiced as a registered architect in Italy and Spain. Her research interests are in the urban transformation, public space dynamics, and the interplay between people and space.
Hello, my name is Ross T. Smith, and I'm presenting on behalf of Cecilia de Marinis as well. I'll be discussing a Master of Architecture studio that Cecilia and I taught last year, entitled On the Verge. The provocation considers thresholds and edge conditions as physical and psychological barriers, boundaries, and transformational positions determined by materiality, physicality, ecology, and sensory perception. The reason I'm talking about this is because experiential learning is the focus of this teaching that we're doing. The purpose was to produce an architectural intervention integrating the landscape and a building. The project site and influence was an abandoned powerhouse in an urban industrial landscape. It was chosen for its prominence in the region of the university, which is near Melbourne, and has easy access for students to do experiential and phenomenological site analysis. Now, the university's response to COVID was that we went into complete lockdown and all classes went online almost immediately. However, we had 1 week before lockdown that students could come to the university, to the site and do some site analysis. However, in Victoria, we've been in Victoria, the state of Australia, we've been in lockdown most of the year. And about 2 months ago, lockdown was lifted mostly, and there's almost no COVID cases here anymore. And so life has become quite normalized. So this is a good thing. However, there's still the tension of having to work carefully and either work online or in physical studio, depending on the situation as it progresses. So site analysis, these are some images from the site. We teach very much from a phenomenological, experiential, and ecological point of view in studios here. And these are some images I took of the site. And we extended the site, the physical land site, 50 meters into the ocean to give the students a greater sense of threshold and edge condition experience that we were looking for. And we can see some of the work the students produced down here in site analysis. Now, phenomenology according to Eugene Fink a while ago, he said, there's wonder in the face of the world, which is quite a great way to talk about the simplicity that we can approach the world with, or the complexity, depending on how much we focus. Now, phenomenology is detailed observation of nature, objects, humanity, and the constructed environment. It's about sensory perception and the presence of self, ephemera conditions, and the unexpected. And I teach the phenomenological theory and philosophy in relation to architecture from years of developing this, and so this becomes an important driver of the studio. So this slide also, and the 3 slides after it, show students' work that is process or final outcomes of the studio. Now, experiential learning is integrated with phenomenology, takes the sort of theory, the pedagogical theory of constructivism, which is about students taking their own responsibility for their learning, about driving the process themselves, and they become very active learners as opposed to passive learners. And this is sort of crucially important when dealing with experiential learning. Experiential learning is a body-mind integration, sort of getting out of the computer, which is such a big thing these days, getting the students embodied back into their bodies and the physicality of being. By thinking, knowing, and acting, we become experiential learners. It's about getting your hands dirty, which is sort of some students are reluctant to do these days. So, the physicality of being in a space and being in a site and being amongst materials. And also, one thing I strongly support and value is experimentation, risk-taking, and fun in the studio. The more students experiment and take risks, the more they're letting go of the sense of being correct and getting things right, and trying to discover what the teacher wants, not what they want. And having fun is really important. Education's got to be about fun, otherwise it's a bit boring for all of us. So the important aspect of experiential learning in a physical studio is the ability to create dynamic and energy amongst a group of people. This strongly aids peer cohesion and learning, and a sense of identifying with a particular studio's direction. Now, peer cohesion is something we've really sort of lost a little bit on the online system, where the sense of all being together physically in a studio, students can sort of integrate and work with each other and learn from each other very directly, whereas online it doesn't seem to happen. And the sudden move to online teaching meant that I personally lost the ability to read body language and read the feel of the room full of students, and the ability to quietly observe the work being done by students and to develop discussions based on these observations. So that sense of the embodied physical environment, was lost online. That's sort of being able to watch and carefully attend to things that popped up, in the space. So online, we had to create new types of experience for students to explore. You encourage them to use their imagination of how a digital event could be experienced in reality. And this is quite a shift for students, like moving into their imagination more, and get them to reflect upon experience and get them to sort of write and talk about what they were experiencing and how they imagine things to be experienced, which is an important aspect. Now, the outcomes for the studio were, there's some of the images as well. And this one at the bottom here by Jack Brown is wacky, but it really was based in biophilia, and a very strong ecological research principles were taken to get to this point. It was quite a fun experiment. This is where experimentation becomes so important in the studio. So experiential learning is essential to architecture design studio teaching because of the physical nature of the learning style. Studio is one class that needs to remain in the realm of human contact in order to deeply engage with the embodied material and physical world. However, the things that were a problem, with online teaching as opposed to physical was the lack of intimacy and the intimate integration between teachers and students, and the really getting to know each other in the real world, I suppose, has to be online. One of the things that students did have to do, they had to become more independent and less and resolve issues themselves, which was important. And the hybrid teaching was a discussion we had with students where the thought was that being partly online and partly in physical studio would be a really good way of teaching studio. So this year, our academic year starts here in February. So something I'm going to explore more of how to create a stronger studio environment with an online physical combination. So that's the end of experiential learning in the studio. It's important and necessary in all teaching, I believe. So thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Our final presentation is by Aki Yoshida, who is an associate professor of architecture at Virginia Tech. They received their MS in advanced architectural design from Columbia University. And her build projects explore interactive lighting and participatory design, and her publications examine architectural materials in broader cultural and social contexts.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, face coverings and partitions that protect people from the virus have enabled individuals to connect by distancing the air they breathe. On February 27th, the World Health Organization published a recommendation to install transparent barriers of glass or acrylic in order to conserve the need for personal protective equipment, or PPE. These barriers perform three functions: to intercept the droplets that carry the virus, to remind people of physical distancing requirements, and to reduce reliance on masks when there is a shortage of PPEs. By mid-March, as schools and offices abruptly locked down, physical barriers quickly appeared in order to flatten the curve of infection rates. No longer limited to medical spaces, clear acrylic barriers were erected to protect the health of employees and customers at cashiers' counters, taxis, buses, post offices, and banks. Plexiglass barriers can remind people of high security, stressful interactions, such as sitting in the backseat of police cars or visiting an incarcerated family member at a prison. Like masks, these barriers have been introduced as an emergency public health measure. However, social implications of these interventions remain largely unconsidered and demand attention. I will present three examples of protective barriers: partitions in offices, partitions in retail shops and restaurants, and face coverings. As people returned to work over the summer, office furniture companies quickly speculated a surge in sales of plexiglass partitions. While barriers can induce a sense of protection, they also result in a sense of separation, obstacle, and hierarchy. An interior full of transparent barriers may resemble scenes from Jacques Tati's 1967 film, Playtime, in which the main character becomes befuddled and lost in the world of modern office cubicles and endless reflections. Over the past couple of decades, companies have removed partitions between employees in order to create less hierarchical, more open, egalitarian office environments conducive to collaborations. Now these barriers may need to be revived for public health. In doing so, companies must be mindful of how these barriers may create unintended hierarchies and obstructions for communication. On September 30th of this year, New York City allowed its restaurants to open indoor dining at 25% capacity. In order to provide more tables that are better ventilated, many eateries expanded their seating to the sidewalks or the parking lanes, activating public life on the street during the summer and fall. However, as cold weather arrived, many restaurants covered outdoor tables with plastic bubble dining pods, which raised public health concerns that these may be incubators for virus transmission. In these dining pods, the transparent barriers that are intended to protect can be deceptive. While the plastic bubbles are located outside of buildings without natural or mechanical ventilation, they're not any safer than indoor seating. In fact, dining in these bubbles can pose more risk than indoor seats. Dr. Lindsay Marr, professor of civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech and an airborne disease transmission expert, says, if someone's infected, there's really a high potential for virus to build up in the air and for everybody in that little bubble to be exposed. Dr. Marr suggests using the bubble only with one's own social pod. Scientific studies have shown that wearing of masks is one of the most effective preventions against the virus. Hiding one's face, however, presents communication concerns. Opaque masks conceal facial expressions and body language that convey emotions. Seeing gestures and mouth movements is more equitable for people with hearing difficulties. Although transparent facial masks have been designed in response to these issues, even a clear material is a barrier. Sounds are muffled, tactility is lost, and reflections on the surface can obstruct vision. There appears to be a great potential and need for developments in wearable ambulatory barriers that connect people socially and emotionally while protecting them from the airborne virus. Sociologist Richard Sennett speculates that social distancing practices will outlast the pandemic due to a learned fear of the invisible. He bases this on examples of security measures practiced immediately after 9/11, such as ID checking and X-ray scanning at building entries and airports that remained the norm decades after the terror attack. As we learn more about COVID-19, we have learned from scientists that some practices, such as incessant wiping down of surfaces, are ineffective, and that others, such as the plastic bubbles with sealed air, present risks. The new normals during and after a pandemic need to be examined critically. Instead of relying solely on physical barriers, how could we combine the barriers with spatial arrangements of seats and improved ventilation, or carefully consider integrating surveillance and contact tracing? Observations of US cities in the last 9 months have uncovered a need to carefully monitor social and emotional impacts of protective barriers as we shield ourselves from the invisible virus.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for great presentations. I just have a few short comments, and then I'll happily open up to Q&A. So if you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A box there. So to begin, I just want to reflect on these projects and note that separately, perhaps they seem as isolated case studies, but really together they are a lesson in adaptation, and they inspire new ways for us to look at our COVID and our post-COVID world. Importantly, these adaptive responses show us how in the Lyman case we can reimagine social interactions, how in the superblocks we can reactivate public spaces, and in office spaces in Abu Dhabi we learn to rework interior design to suit pandemic and post-pandemic needs. And in the paper on protective barriers shows us how to reevaluate the effects and impacts of these personal protection equipment. And finally, the paper on experiential learning shows us how to recreate design and recreate spaces. So more specifically, on liming and commenting, I found that social interaction and engagement was an essential component of everyday life, but an unpredictable byproduct of this, this new kind of relocation of liming social locations was a sort of legitimization of the practice and by change of location. In this way, this cultural event has become sort of an institutionalized event and recognized to some capacity by the government. In the superblock, we learned to reactivate these social spaces. And so social networks existed within these invisible barriers. While inherent design characteristics allowed for adaptation, the success is due to the community's exercise needs for social spaces within a shared space, and one that was insulated to external forces such as this COVID spread. And the workspaces in Abu Dhabi showed us the need to redesign according to a re-examination of productivity, efficiency, and importantly, physical comfort. We learned that we have to have a personal work-life balance, and more importantly, we have to respond to employees' needs and how they can feel that they can be more safe, healthful, and productive in their work. when we looked at protective barriers, we learned to reevaluate how we deal with responses. So in office partitions, restaurant bubbles, and face coverings, they're simply crisis solutions, but they force us to reevaluate this new normal, and more importantly, the implications of these design interventions and how they can impact people's everyday lives. And finally, though, going out of order, experiential learning teaches us how to recreate. So experiential learning allows us to put to practice these adaptive learning techniques that I spoke about previously. And by extension, they teach us to learn how to resituate ourselves physically in what is otherwise a predominantly virtual pandemic and post-pandemic life. In looking at these presentations, I wanted to ask several questions, and I will happily, of course, defer to the Q&A. But just thinking about the presentations, I wanted to understand how better to react to the problems that arise due to COVID limitations. And so how these protective barriers, for example, address the repercussions of crisis responses. And also I wanted to think about in the super blocks, if this was just a product of circumstance, if in fact the responses by the community were exclusive to that environment and they were therefore the most effective option, or simply that they were kind of helped along by the circumstances of this living environment. So I think I'll begin with a question for the team from Abu Dhabi. And we have a question about how they envision what workplaces will be like. And I'll add on to that question and say, if we could quickly reflect on what the workplace was like prior to COVID and then how you imagine the design will be now. I think that's for Musa or Hera. They're here.
Yeah, hi. So the question was how we are going to imagine the future of the workplace design is going to be. So first, the pandemic is continuing its risk over the world, and even now it's having more serious side effects. And in my point of view, first, the countries will accommodate the remote working and allow the people to work from home. And as a result shows that they had a lot of a more balanced work and life balance between them. And this will ultimately incite that then there is a need to draw a new guidelines of workplace design and office layout so to satisfy the occupants' needs and also to address the requirement of safety and sustainability. And also it's gonna put the hygiene at the heart of the designing. For example, and point of view of in designing for offices, we may allocate more square footage per employee than existing buildings, with some offices potentially gravitating to more individual office spaces rather than open floor plans. And with a primer focus on meeting places, as a result shows that people are missing the meeting places, gathering with people and to connect with their colleagues. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. No, that's perfect. It's a perfect response. Thank you very much. I think I'll just pop on ahead to a project that received a couple of questions. I'll begin first with Federico on the Superblock project, and then Nicole, I'll turn to you for a question on liming and commenting. So Federico, I think there's the question of, was this a product of circumstance, or was there something specific to the design of the Superblocks that really was sort of universal? A universe would address the COVID crisis. So if you could quickly just kind of speak to that. Oh, can you unmute yourself, please? Okay. Frederick, I'm going to come back to you in 1 minute. I'm going to pop on to Nicole for the Superblock question. I'm sorry, the liming question. I think that people wanted to understand what was the actual impact of this relocation of the sort of the social experience of liming, because I think we learned about how they were relocated and that spoke a lot to the social interactions, but didn't actually speak to the technical effects.
I think the material effects we tried to highlight were mostly the kind of physical barriers that were put in place. And what I thought was really interesting were also the outdoor sinks that were actually installed on sidewalks, which I think kind of points to potential for like lots of such sanitary interventions, which could be useful past the time of COVID as well. I don't know if Renelle wants to add something. She's in Trinidad, so maybe she has something more specific to add.
Sure.
Maybe I can just add that during the period, the responses actually varied. So in the beginning, people adhered to rules that were set out. However, we noticed that people began to resist those rules a bit. When we realized that numbers were particularly low and people felt a sense of normalcy returning. So I think maybe that was an important part of the response as well. Not only did we pay attention to the rules and obey the rules, there began to be a form of resistance to the rules that were implemented.
Maybe there's a normal response in a lot of places. Thank you very much. Federico, are we able to return to you to answer that question about product of circumstance, or if in fact it was a creative response?
Yeah, excuse me, can you repeat please the question, as I couldn't hear due
Sure.
to problems to my Wi-Fi connection, please? Thank you.
Sure, no problem. The question had to do with whether or not the success in limiting COVID spread in the superblock was just simply a product of design circumstance, or if in fact there was a specific creative solution that allowed for these communities to kind of endure without spreading the virus.
Yeah, well, this solution was thought as a pre-pandemic solution to improve environmental and climate change issues in the whole city. And as far as we conduct a survey in the late September, we found out that citizens, residents and non-residents in this superblock claim that this solution is a very good solution to improve the health of people, but there is no public survey on COVID-19 effects on population health during the last 11 months.
Okay. Do you think that this sort of the lifestyle, the superblock, or the design will continue to be maintained and or thrive and increase in other areas?
Yes, well, in the early November, the mayor Ada Colau promoted the extension of this measure in the most central district of Barcelona, that is called Eixample. It is the Cerdàs extensions, but there are in program 503 superblocks within the whole city. The problem is the financing of this operation, as they are really expensive. In Poblenou, it cost around 3.5 million euros, while in another place more than 8. So if you implement 5,000 superblocks, if you calculate it, you know, it's very expensive.
It's quite an expense. Okay, thank you very much. Aki, I have a question for you, simply personal interest living in New York and seeing these sort of the restaurant bubbles pop up and shake my head and walk past. And you say that we have to understand the repercussions of these designs, but of course we have to enable social interactions to some capacity to maintain some sense of normalcy, whatever minimal it can be. What is your recommendation, either through personal PPE or the bubbles, or, you know, or barriers, whatever you think? Could you provide a thought on how we could better address these solutions?
Sure. I'm speaking as an architect and not as a medical professional, but I think many of us would agree that one of the benefits of having gone through this pandemic is activation of public spaces, outdoor public spaces. And it's, as urban planners or designers, it's been delightful to see our sidewalks and roads become activated, our parking spots replaced with outdoor seating. So I think it's been particularly difficult in winter because it's harder to be outside in cold weather. But if these shelters could be better ventilated, not as sealed up as some bubbles are, and if we could still keep our masks on when possible. I think there are ways to keep what's been beneficial socially while staying safe. Or that is my
For
hope.
certain. I mean, if you came to walk through my neighborhood, you would have a serious anxiety attack with the number of restaurants are considered to be safe outdoor dining, but people need their sense of normalcy.